Welcome to the Excellence at Work podcast, where we explore the strategies and best practices that drive business success. I'm Rachel Cooke, COO of Brandon Hall Group and the host of our podcast, along with members of our executive team. In each episode, we'll dive into the latest trends, insights, and real-world examples from some of the most exciting leaders from organizations worldwide. Be part of our journey and learn from the best as we discuss innovative approaches and cutting-edge technologies for talent management, learning and development, leadership, diversity and inclusion, and more. Hi, I'm Rachel Cooke with Brandon Hall Group. Welcome to our podcast, Excellence at Work. It's great to be here today. And with me joining is Ashley Williams, the CEO and CLO from Darden Executive Education and Lifelong Learning and the UVA Darden Sands Institute for Lifelong Learning. Welcome, Ashley.
Delighted to be here.
I am excited to chat with you today, and we're going to be talking about the imperative of lifelong learning, shifting realities, roles, and responsibilities in the talent force. We have a lot of interesting nuggets and insights that we're going to talk about, and some of the research and work that you have underway. Also, congratulations. I just want to give a shout out to you and your team for receiving 3 gold Brandon Hall Group Excellence Awards and a silver this year for Best Leadership Development, Best Unique and Innovative Leadership Program, Best Executive Development Program, and Best Association Professional Development Program. We've celebrated a little bit earlier this year with you and your team through our virtual celebration. We're excited to continue the celebration, our Brandon Hall Group Excellence Conference 2025. And we are also thankful and looking forward to your support as a platinum sponsor. We were just talking about the session that you're going to be covering around managing up and at scale. So stay tuned. If you find our talk today interesting, just wait till the end of January. So Ashley, tell us a little bit about your background and your experience and what brought you to Darden and
So I've actually been doing talent learning, leadership development for probably a little over 20 years. I know that shows my age, but have been in there for a little bit over 20 years. I joined Darden about 5 years ago to lead all of the essentially non-degree programming at Darden UVA. For those who maybe aren't familiar, Darden is UVA's, University of Virginia's business school that provides the MBA degree. And they've also, since their inception, been doing lifelong learning and executive education. And so I lead all of the lifelong learning and executive education efforts at Darden. And prior to that, I spent 20 plus years at McKinsey and Company. And for the last 15-ish that I was there, I was involved in leading not only the internal learning and development efforts, but also and people strategy, but also serving clients on topics of learning, leadership development, and overall talent strategies.
Oh, great company. We work a lot with McKinsey and Consulting, and so you're very lucky. You're very fortunate to be at 2 great organizations, or just great cultures at both. And
I very much agree.
And the work that you do about lifelong learning is fascinating, and it continues to evolve through research, through neuroscience, through understanding of human ability and capabilities, and really what triggers them to learn and to apply and to perform or to react, both positively and sometimes negatively. And so kind of understanding the dynamics is a fascinating topic, and a lot of what we do here at Brandon Hall Group, and having the opportunity to work with companies like you and to partner with your teams and to recognize the great work through your client examples or bodies of research. So, what is your perspective on lifelong learning?
So I think I couldn't be more excited, as you said, than to be in the industry, if you will, of lifelong learning and talent management. Every single time I do one of these podcasts or I think about my life and where am I headed next and what am I doing, I say this couldn't be a more exciting time to be in lifelong learning. I feel like it does evolve. The concept is not really a new one, right? The concept of lifelong learning has been around for quite a while. Some would go back to, for example, the 60-year curriculum and some of that was put out and talked about the imperative that is lifelong learning. I know we'll probably talk a little bit more later about the fact that as lives get longer, this becomes even more of an imperative for folks to continue to learn across their life in order to either advance or be fully fulfilled in their life. And there's a lot of shifts that are happening in lifelong learning. And I think it continues to shift and evolve. There's a lot of concepts that have been, I would say, morphing, changing, shifting, and are now starting to, I think, kind of come together in lifelong learning. Some would say that AI and Gen AI and technology and disruptions over the last, not only the AI, but even the last technological revolution was one reason why these things are starting to come together, because we just have more access to tools and ways in which we can access lifelong learning that maybe you didn't have before. So that's really exciting. And then there's also, I think, some scarier things, right, about that are pushing lifelong learning to the forefront in terms of the imperative. Just the mobility in the workforce, the need for that, the changing skill sets and the requirements around changing skill sets that can be, scary if you think about the model when I went through and did my K through 12 and then went to college and then did my master's degree. But the reality is, even then I had to keep learning. Even now it's even more imperative. I feel it even in my job today, and I'm at the center of lifelong learning. I feel like I myself have to keep track and have to keep up. And that can feel, I think, a little bit scary, and it can feel like it's a displacement potentially that's happening. And then I think there's geopolitical and other forces that sometimes we like to separate out from what implications those have. But I think they have big implications and can have pretty big implications for not only how people access, learning, but how they're rewarded for that learning, how they have to pay, for that learning or not pay for that learning, and the roles of the institutions that are all involved in learning, whether that be the workforce or whether that be academia or whether that be, the learner themselves. So I feel like there is a imperative. It is not a new imperative, but it feels renewed. I think the spotlight of AI and some of those disruptive forces in the economy are shining even more of a sort of a light, a light on it, and shining on the importance, which again means that all of us that are in this, if you will, sector, in this industry, helping people to reach their full potential, we've got big jobs, and it's really exciting.
Yes. And bringing it back to organizations and the research shows about 50% of CEOs rank talent as a top challenge. And data, this number has not really moved. Like if I looked at probably like 10 years ago, we were talking talent shortages. 20 years ago, talent shortages. So I think this number's a constant with how innovation rapidly evolves from decade to decade. And then the people, there's only a segment of innovators, right? Or those that are progressive or have an understanding of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody else kind of has to figure it out. And usually the younger generations kind of grow up with that technology, so they embrace it quicker, but they don't have the experience or the work experience that can kind of morph those two as easily sometimes. So it's interesting, though, how, with the talent shortage and the continuous need to find top talent, how should organizations rethink their approach to lifelong learning?
Well, I mean, one of the things we've been exploring is the analogy to there's a huge body of work out there around customer experience. So reorienting your entire way of working and an organization around putting the customer, if you will, at the experience. If we apply that same concept to putting the employee or putting the learner or putting the human, essentially, at the center, what would it do? What would that tell you? What would that tell companies around how they might need to change, these experiences? And I think if you think about the traditional kind of talent wheel, whatever framework you want to use in terms of the integrated talent management or workforce management, and you think about those systems, right? I'm not just talking about IT, I'm talking about systems, operations, protocols, et cetera. If you actually put the learner and the human at the center, what would that tell you about what you would need to change? And we're increasingly seeing that if you do that, then you have to better understand people's paths and pathways through companies, recognizing that in many cases, you're one pit stop because most people, I think the latest stat is something like people change jobs 12 times, in their lifetime or something like that. This is not the day of I started at said company and I finish at said company, right? It's just, I don't think that will necessarily ever revert back. So organizations have to start thinking about what's their role in that, in that overall time frame, recognizing that they may be having people coming in to their own, workforce that haven't had the experiences that they're necessarily providing. So there's just a lot about being able to be more, I mean, the word personalized has been thrown around, I think maybe a little bit too much personally in the last 10 years, but it is about being personalized in the sense of really understanding that workforce and then being able to flex programming. One size fits all doesn't really work, anymore in terms of providing that. And then also, I think the other thing to think of that organizations have to start thinking about is how they're supporting at every single level. When I came into Darden Executive Education, there were a lot of strategy discussions about where should we focus, right? And executive education has a little bit of a certain when you think executive education, because the word executive, you think top of the pyramid, if you will. And, my, if you will, argument strategically when I came 5 years ago was that's completely insufficient. If we're going to be a institution that supports companies as they evolve their talent force and think about this, then we got to think much more holistically at all different, at all different levels, and therefore requires investment at those different levels. And the investment may look different, but only thinking about, well, once somebody gets manager, I pay attention, or once they get into the C-5, I pay attention. I think that's kind of a little bit of a fool's errand, given you're going to continuously have the workforce changes, the attrition, those type of things, given the nature of work today. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about, but really with the mindset of we've always, as people who are learning and development focused, you always put them at the center of creating a program, right? And I use that, my air quotes. You always do that. But I think that for workforce and talent force, companies need to be thinking about putting the employee really, at the center. And what does that mean about their holistic experience?
You also talk a lot about the tri-ownership model between
Yeah.
individuals, organizations, and academia. How can these stakeholders better collaborate to create more effective learning pathways throughout people's careers? And I think, kind of this is a good segue from you mentioned putting people first.
Right. Yeah. It was very interesting. I think I shared with you before that we had our first SANS Institute for Lifelong Learning convening back in April of this year. The SANS Institute for Lifelong Learning was established in 2020, essentially, and so relatively new, and was done through a gift from an alumni whose quote is like on our wall. So every day that I walk into the office, I see it, and it says one of the greatest gifts in life is is learning and education. And his whole gift um, was around let's create more access for people to getting, kind of great education. But we were asking the question in this um, forum. We brought together companies, military, government, and public policy. We brought together private equity. Um, we brought together academia, and not just UVA, but more broadly UVA, um, to ask the question: well, what should the model look like? What is this ecosystem? And I know we'll talk about that maybe a little later, but what does the ownership model need to look like? And what we clearly heard as we all sort of came together is coming at it from very sort of, if you want to call it silos perspectives, or maybe, obviously selfish business, based, perspective, um, is probably not going to work that effectively going forward. But that it because of all the fragmentation, because the lives are longer, because the workforce is being disrupted in constant technology innovation, that no one of these groups, whether it be academia or the companies themselves or the individuals, can alone kind of keep up. Like we need these folks to all be kind of working together differently. But also what came out of that discussion was this is incredibly difficult, right? This is not something that is easy to create a sort of whatever coopetition that some people talk about, and collaboration, just because of the ingrained nature of the economics of, for example, if you're just thinking about the learner or academia or business, the ingrained economics of those things make them make specific choices. Even the economics of how academia, for example, has been funded, and higher education programs have been funded. I mean, all these things are sort of making it more difficult to break out of a model where you're kind of individually just staying in your lane versus thinking about how do we weave these lanes together throughout someone's lifespan. We definitely didn't come to I will say we didn't have an answer that we came out of that, but we said there's more that can be done to work together.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's certainly, I think the more that you partner together and the more that our academia understands the challenges of the workforce and how the learning can help solve those problems, truly solve those problems. Um, where it's not just learning for the sake of learning, but it's learning to help them fulfill and make their career more meaningful and more productive. And so it's, again, there's not just an answer that you can say, you do this right and you'll get this. I think it's a culmination of a lot of different things. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, so that we truly understand how better to bridge academia and organizations together. And the research shows that of today's workforce, that about 60% of today's workforce does not have a college degree. Yet bachelor degrees are often used as a proxy for management roles. So how can we create opportunities and better pathways for leadership to promote these talented individuals without traditional credentials?
Yeah, we got really interested in this, and this is, as you mentioned earlier, something that we'll spend a little bit of time on also at the event, at the Brandon Hall event. We got really interested in this last year. In this, all we did was say, what do we know about the transition from those who have never been a manager into the managerial role? What do we know about the skills that are needed for that? What do we know about that population? And what do we think we, as academia, as a top business school, could do in this space in order to support those learners? Because so one thing we found out, we partnered with Burning Glass Institute, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of, they have one of the single biggest job data sets in the US, where they get all of the job and they're able to use AI, our favorite tool, and all kinds of data manipulation to sort of understand what is it that employers are saying that they need from different roles and jobs, right? Because what better place to understand that than looking at what they're posting that they say they need. So they combed through all of those job postings along certain sectors. One thing, we learned is that indeed the degree is being used as a proxy for whether or not someone can manage. And the question is that necessary? Why? Well, why is it being used? It's being used because it's easy. It's easier for sure, right? To be able to say, well, at least we know this person has put in the 4 years, the 4+ or whatever it is, time frame, and right. So it's not nefarious. It's just is. It's what's been in place for a very long time. There's an organization that's led by one of my former colleagues at McKinsey, Byron McGeast, called the paperceiling.org. For those that are interested, go take a look at that in terms of the paper ceiling. So having said that, the other thing we learned is when you comb through all of these job descriptions, what they're asking for in terms of the skills, there were sort of 4 buckets of skills that they were asking for, was squarely what we were teaching in business schools, undergraduate business schools, non-degree programming, et cetera, around leadership, communication, data analytics, basic finance skills that don't necessarily require a degree, but it does require some amount of education around those things. You can't expect someone to just jump into that and understand, those dynamics. So we got really excited about that because as soon as we saw that there wasn't that was our hypothesis, by the way, that there wasn't some weird thing that was in these job descriptions, that actually these were core fundamental sort of business management skills that have been taught for a very long time, and we know they're teachable. We said, well, then maybe we can do something about this. Maybe back to the point about how to partner differently, maybe we can partner with companies to create a real program that's accessible to folks that maybe don't have a degree, or even if they do have a degree, but they're still bumping up against that. They can't get out of the, frontline supervisor, and that what they want to be is in a managerial role. Maybe we can come up with something that we can work together. And we have been hearing fantastic. We talked to 30+ companies at this point. They're very excited about what could be a product here, because what you bring together is the real needs of the company and the ability to personalize to what that company needs. And you bring together the fact that you have a credentialed institution that has been teaching these business fundamentals for a long time, right? That can bring that in a way that maybe the company can't bring themselves. So we're very excited, about this. And look, by our estimations, you're talking about, this is just a US-based analysis, but by our estimation, you're talking about $10 billion of economic mobility you could unlock if just a portion of these folks, we're calling them hidden talent, just a portion of these folks could be elevated into managerial roles. You're unlocking significant economic mobility for those individuals, and you're helping the companies, because these new manager roles have high attrition, there's a lot of turnover, and they're very hard to find.
And it helps with retention, as you mentioned, because if people reach a certain threshold, then they disengage, or if they're talented individuals, they may not have had the traditional education, but they do still know their self-worth well, technically, and will move on into maybe an environment that doesn't require that type of degree necessarily to move up or
Mhm.
or or unfortunately they may reach their capacity and not their potential. So
Exactly. That's what you really, when you really look at it, you think, wow, the hidden talent concept, there's so much potential, there. And it's sort of rather than recycling,
mhm,
talent amongst a smaller subset, open the access to a
right.
much wider swath of people in order to help them, reach their potential. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's what gets us really excited about and this gets back to I think what I said earlier too in terms of companies needing to think across the entire band of talent, because historically there's been a mindset of we don't spend money on learning, development, etc. We
Mhm.
spend a certain amount for this band of people, a certain amount for this band of people, a certain amount of this band for people, and it's all very restricted by, clunky, frankly, ROI, calculations and those type of things. When you look at this, the ROI calculation for any company, if they move from 5% promotion into managerial roles to 30% upward mobility, the ROI will come. It will be very easy for them, for you to be able to talk about, the ROI. But the mindset of how do we think differently about the entire talent force, I think, is a pretty important element of this as well.
And you also mentioned the life capacity, living longer. And
Right.
so I think kind of that third career or third quarter,
Hmm.
third dimension.
Right.
How or what are you offering or what is being reimagined for this cohort?
It's so interesting because so we've been thinking about the concept of pathways and
Mhm.
someone's lifelong learning pathways. And again, strategically, when we looked at, okay, what are we providing today? A lot of, and it was sort of middle management to senior management, right? All the way up to sort of C-suite. And we said, okay, let's look at these new managers. Let's look further, if you will, earlier in someone's, if you will, career or pathway. And then we said, well, what happens afterwards? And what's interesting is that this was brought to us by a couple of board members that said, how are we thinking about, what's next? And then simultaneously, there were a couple of articles, you may have seen them in the Wall Street Journal over the past probably 6 months, that were talking about this growing set of programs that different organizations, not just academia, by the way, but definitely academic institutions. I mean, Harvard has had one for 20 plus years called I think theirs is called the Advanced Leadership Program. I forget the exact acronyms. Um, but with lifespans, expanding, um, and people wanting, and in some cases needing, to have more work in their, in their third, if you will, in their third quarter. Um, what do we do to help people, maneuver that? Because the historic mindset is you've reached a certain age, then you retire, then you go off and you play golf every day, and that's just, first of all, the workforce needs something more than that. In terms of talent, again, finding talent, keeping talent, using talent, and then on the flip side, the human needs more than that, as well. So it was a very interesting confluence of, we'd been thinking about pathways, then we had some board members who are at that stage of their life, right, saying, could Darden do something in this space? Because we think it's so important. Could UVA and Darden do something in this space? And then simultaneously, you're seeing a lot of schools thinking about this. So we're in early stages. I think we'll probably have a program out, if you will, by next year. But the question is, what is the right, what is the right set of things to help? And it's not just what we, back again to the triathlete or the tri ownership, piece of this. We can create programs, but also the workforce needs to be thinking, and obviously the individual learner can take it upon themselves to care about this and and invest in themselves. But what can the workforce do? Back to what's their role? And I think there's a lot of reimagining that needs to get done in terms of what roles can and do people want to play that can be valuable, that are not 9 to 5 or more,
Right.
type of models. And I would think that with, digital innovations, workforce innovations in terms of expectations that have shifted, post COVID around workforce and when you're in the workforce, I would think that there's a lot of opportunity for employers, to be thinking about that differently and then supporting people as they get to that age in exploring what it is that they want to do, right?
Right.
I also think there's opportunities for employers to think about their societal give back, meaning if they've got particular, I won't call it nonprofit, but foundation based or initiatives that they want to do to better society that aren't directly linked to the commercial, if you will, interest of companies. There's a whole swath of people that will be at this stage of their life that would love to be connected to something like that and help a company,
Right.
right? So could we play matchmaker somehow, right, in putting these things together? So we're getting really excited about this stage, right?
I think that this group of this generation would be really good for the culture and
Yeah.
really good for their brand. So
Hmm.
doing initiatives that tie into that line of work, where they
Yep.
have the experience, they've seen decades of different,
Yep.
feast and fathoms of how, history has evolved and how they can see, different patterns or different things that maybe, other generations are not thinking about that could be beneficial for a whole set of a whole set of things. Yeah.
And
But
it's really been interesting as we've been doing focus groups to this point. It's really been fascinating talking to folks that are sort of in this period and are thinking about it because they are very eager to learn also, like the cross menteeing thing
Mhm.
and mentoring that can happen, like being a mentor to that next generation in some form or fashion, but also learning themselves from the next generation. They feel, they're starting to feel even more quickly obsolete, to use a terrible term because that feels terrible to say, but that's how people are starting to feel, and the pace of that obsolescence is picking up. And
Right.
so their ability to stay connected means that they're connecting to society and to one another, and so they see that cross benefit like immediately. It's not tough to get them to see it. Maybe tough to get the younger generation necessarily see it, but it's not as tough to get, that generation to see it. And I think getting the companies to understand how they might harness that value as well could be a
Mhm.
really interesting, third leg of this stool, because I think it's going to take that. It's not enough for individuals to be running around thinking about what they want to do next if there's not real meaningful opportunities for them to do it.
Right.
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 Yeah.
And also we, before I just have a couple more things to touch on here before we wrap up, but we talked a little bit about AI and generative
Mhm.
AI. What are some of the things? How are you using it to help accelerate your programs or help build or provide, content or learning to your learners?
We are in what I would call sort of, I saw some report of university-based providers of executive education. And I think it's at something like less than 20% are sort of in this experimental phase. And that's where I would say we definitely are. We are not only thinking about curriculum on the topic of AI, and in fact, UVA Darden just launched a new Ethical Institute of AI, and so the SANS Institute and the Ethical Institute of AI are working closely together curriculum wise to make sure that we have courses that are speaking to the topic of AI. That's one thing. So we're definitely doing that, and we're trying to listen to businesses because I'm not even sure that the businesses necessarily know what they need, right? In terms of everybody knows they need some baseline courses on what is Gen AI and how to use it, right? But we actually are partnering with Google to provide access to their Google Essentials and embedding that in some of our courses, because we're not the right ones to necessarily be doing that, right? Google is, or Microsoft is, or those guys can provide that. What we're trying to look at is how can we use it. All these wonderful. There's a whole subset which I know you're intimately familiar with of startups and others that are doing things about how do you embed AI actually in the learning experience and use it, whether it's to personalize or for practice, or for kind of certification purposes. That's what we're starting to experiment. And I would say we're in more experimental stages. I don't know anyone, at least at the university-based providers, that are way far, advanced yet. I think we're all trying to figure that out. But we're looking to guidance from our clients to tell
Mhm.
us, okay, well, what would be actually helpful, while also going to the market and looking at these different providers that have some really cool things. Like, we're working with one to create case studies. Darden is a very Socratic case-based school. So we've been looking for partners that can use and embed case-based studies using AI in some of our digital courses. And we just launched that into one of our courses. So I would say we're kind of in these experimental stages where we're trying to keep up with the content and do that through the business school, and trying to listen, right? Listen to companies that say, this is the kind of stuff we need content-wise. But sometimes I don't think any of us know really, what we need. And then we're experimenting with how do we fully embed it in some of the learning experiences that we're creating. And I think our first out of the gate was pretty fun, and that people were really liking it in terms of this case-based thing. I think one of the other central questions that everyone's asking is whether or not leadership skills change with AI, which was the same question that was asked as the first, sort of technology revolution came. Do your skill sets change? Does the leadership model change? Are there big changes that this is going to create in terms of my own skill set as a leader, in an organization? Again, other than the baseline understanding what the heck Gen AI is and how to use it, for my company or for me personally in my day to day. I think the verdict is still out on that, because for years we've been talking about technology disruption, and what do leaders need to do? What is the skill set around that?
Mhm.
And a lot of the same leadership skills are required. The human skills, the communication skills, the what some people call the softer, sort of skills. Those things are not changing
Mhm.
materially yet. And in fact, some people are saying you need them more.
Right.
So that question is too new. I don't think anybody knows the answer yet, but maybe you've heard something else.
What about the emotional intelligence and the leadership style? 'Cause that has changed. The fundamentals of
Mhm.
leadership maybe not has changed, though the style and the way that we communicate has changed
Has changed. Yeah. And I heard something really interesting the other
in
day.
some
Uh,
in some capacity.
in some capacity, and actually, some people are saying you're going to need it even more.
Mhm.
In other words, the emotional connection, the emotional quotient,
Mhm.
whatever framework you use, is even getting more important
Mhm.
when you're having to navigate so much more sort of technology. And then I heard something interesting the other day. Someone said, "Oh, you're going to have to know how to manage robots." And I
Mhm.
said, "Okay, like your workforce, like if you're a manager or a leader, it's not just that you're managing a force of humans, you're actually managing a force of these things coming together." And I said, "Well, does anybody know what that takes?" Right, in the conversation. Of course, the answer is absolutely not. Like, we don't even know what the emotional quotient, to use your right. What is the emotional quotient for managing robot?
Mhm.
Is there one? What is it? How does that reflect on how you manage the humans? And there's just it's, to me, it's fascinating. I don't necessarily see it as completely dystopian. I think some people see it as quite scary and
Mhm.
dystopian. I'm not quite there yet. I'm a little bit more upbeat, but it is a fascinating question.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Where we sit 10 years from now, if it's
Exactly.
or if we're still having a similar conversation and it hasn't moved that much. Because
Right.
that sometimes, and being in the learning industry now myself for over 15 years, maybe 20, I'm not sure. I have to think about that for a second. It's interesting because some of the conversations are still the same
Right.
you had 20 years ago about, learning needs a seat at the table or HR needs a seat at the table. The ROI piece hasn't
Hmm.
changed. And, how learning could be more meaningful, that hasn't changed.
Right.
I think the learner experience has changed, more focused about the person, and the experience has been evolving and has
Right.
been, I think, a front and center for a good while now. That versus maybe 2 decades ago
Yeah,
was
I would agree.
part of that discussion. So it's interesting. We'll definitely have to pick back up in 10 years.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
See where we are.
Right.
One last question I have, and this is related to our study that we put out every year, looking at the HCM landscape. And
Hmm.
we ask learning and talent and HCM professionals how they are prioritizing their resources and time going into the next year. What do you see as, if you could sum up, some of the critical things that these professionals, these organizations should be focusing on to drive engagement, performance, learning outcomes, a whole, and you don't have to cover everything because we could spend another hour talking. But what, if there's a couple of things that you feel very passionate about or that you see are kind of bubbling to the top that we should pay attention to, what are they?
Yeah, I think I would probably separate this by kind of two categories. Like if you look at content based, because we talk a lot to companies about what are some of the content and topics that are bubbling to the top so that we can make sure we have either research or appropriate coursework for that. And then and then I would say then there's the kind of the demographics or the communities or the populations. So on the content, topics, I think we talked about a few we've gone here that are bubbling to the top. Of course, everybody's frantic around AI, and I do use the word frantic because I think it's a little bit of one of those things where so if we would just slow down, we would be a little bit better off, right? In terms of, but I think people feel like there's not a lot of real option to completely slow down, right? Or they'll be left behind, and I sort of get that. And so we're seeing an imperative around AI, but again, as I said, a layer around what is ethical AI, what is the role of business in AI, and how are you supporting the learners on that. Um, the other content topic that is just not changing, and in fact, I think related to AI is actually accelerating that we're hearing, is the ability to help organizations be more to manage change better. Just because the pace of change, which again, we've been saying, I don't even know how long we've been talking about the VUCA world and the yada yada. I mean, all of those frameworks. But the sense that how do you actually manage change? How do you get organizations to be, if you will, change ready all the time, not just we have a change management program, but that we are an organization that evolves and change seems to be bubbling to the top. And again, I think it's partially related to the AI and the freneticism, right? Because people are saying, well, things will change, and we have to be, ready for that. And then I think the other topic we're increasingly, I think that's just is the world sort of world view, geopolitical, what are the implications of that? It seems to be so top of mind right now. And what do you really do? Like, what are the implications of that for different businesses, whether they be, multinationals, or not, more domestic? But that seems to be just so, excuse me, top of mind, right, for people going into going into this year. I mean, it has been, but it seems to have gotten even more critical. There's a feeling right now that the geopolitical landscape is going to either erupt or something is going to happen that's going to, really be important for companies and therefore for workforces, right? So what does that mean? On the populations, so off of content and onto populations, I do think this new the manager shift and the new manager shift in the population is something that we really believe that companies should be looking at and that we're very excited, about looking at in particular. On top of course, we're not ignoring the rest of the populations, but the importance of that population and what are we going to do differently about it seems to be, one of those top skills or top groups, right, that people are thinking about. I feel like is it raining where you are?
No, it just might be, we've
It sounds
been
like rain or wind or something. Yeah.
maybe a little bit of static here, but
Oh,
no,
okay.
it's sunny and beautiful outside.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, lots of great stuff to think about, to consider as we move into next year, and really glad that we had this conversation as we wrap up here almost in 2024, and look forward to seeing you at our conference.
Yes.
And thank you for sharing all your good thoughts here, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you everyone for listening in as well, and signing in with us.
Well, thank you so much.